Your Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, the theme of this session is how to plan for action in the face of climate change. And we can think about how we are going to adapt to climate change, but it would be arrogant to pretend that we can understand how the Arctic ecosystem, Arctic life, is going to respond. And the question that I want to ask you here is, what can we do to ensure that the Arctic ecosystem is going to be resilient and in good condition to adapt to climate change? What can we do now? How can we act now to make sure that the Arctic animals don't go away with the disappearing ice? This summer, I led an expedition in collaboration with the Russian Geographical Society to Franz Josef Land, which is the northernmost archipelago in Eurasia. The islands are still covered by ice in the summer, covered by glaciers, but the water in between them is open water. There was no sea ice. We saw 40 polar bears, but most of them were eating grass and seabirds. The bulk of the polar bear population was elsewhere. Walruses were very abundant. We counted about 3,000 walruses in 25 islands, which increases the abundance estimates of the population. So walruses are doing fine so far. And we also estimate that there are about 1 million seabirds on this archipelago that depend on ocean resources, on little shrimp and little fish. And underwater, there are lush and productive kelp forests that host a variety of organisms like these delicate anemones. But the ecosystem of Franz Josef Land, as well as in other places of the Arctic, has dramatically changed in the last century. Franz Josef Land is one of these places that was explored by the early Russian, European, and American explorers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And some of them took very valuable photographs, like this one on McClintock Island, taken in August 1903. As you can see, the surface of the sea was covered with sea ice, even in August. We went back to the same place exactly 110 years later, and this is what we saw. The sea ice was gone, as was for the entire archipelago. This is a fact that is affecting the rest of the Arctic. The minimum sea ice cover happened last year, but if we compare this year, the loss of ice equals a surface about the size of twice the state of Texas, or to make it more relevant to this meeting, more than 11 times the size of Iceland. The high Arctic ecosystem depends on ice. In the winter, most of the sea is covered with ice. And this is an animation that is supposed to work, but I will speak and you imagine the animation. In the summer, some of this pack ice melts, and then the sunlight increase allows for blooms of microscopic algae living under the ice that are eaten by little shrimp-like creatures that in turn are eaten by Arctic cod, then by seals, and on top of the food chain by polar bears. The increased sunlight and higher productivity of the water in the summer also produces plankton blooms in open waters, which also feed these little crustaceans that are eaten by seabirds, like the little auks. And the walruses dive on the muddy bottoms in search for clams. This is the simplified food chain of the food web of the high Arctic. But this is the Arctic of the past. Now in the summer, the ice is receding, waters are warmer and more acidic. So what's going to happen to the Arctic ecosystem during these several months when the ice is gone? There could be different scenarios. It could happen like this. The ice recedes, disappears. And the polar bears go away with the seals and the Arctic cod to the areas where the last ice is going to be found. So the polar bear population is going to be reduced. and the polar bears that are stuck on land are going to end up eating grass and seabirds. The water is going to be more acidic, which will affect also the clam populations, which will create thinner shells, and this also will reduce the population of walruses. And the Arctic plankton is already being replaced by Atlantic plankton coming with the warmer waters, and this Atlantic plankton is smaller and less nutritious, which also affects the seabird populations. Or maybe this is not what's going to happen. Maybe the food web is going to take a completely different path. Maybe Atlantic cod coming to the north with increasing temperatures, as we are seeing in the Barents Sea, will be able to feed the seal population, which then would be maybe based on land instead of based on the ice. And that might help buffer the decline in the polar bear population. And maybe these little fish coming from the south with increasing warmer seawater will also help to maintain that seabird population. Or maybe not. Maybe the food web will take a completely different path. We have no idea what's going to happen to the Arctic ecosystem. We don't have a crystal ball for the future of Arctic biodiversity. All we know is that it's going to be very, very different from the past. So now the question is, what can we do about this? Can we do anything? And the answer is yes. If we want to ensure that the Arctic ecosystem is resilient and able to adapt to the loss of ice, we need to reduce other human impacts. In tropical coral reefs, warm years cause bleaching and death for many corals, but in unfished areas that have sharks and all these large predators, the system comes back. In the Arctic, increasing the resilience means reducing other impacts. So, therefore, we need to create an Arctic network of nature reserves that are going to be off limits to industrial fishing, pollution, and other human activities, to ensure that the Arctic ecosystem will be able to respond and adapt to climate change. Imagine a network of reserves spread across the Arctic. Imagine what will be the largest Arctic legacy in human history. And Arctic governments and the Arctic Council must take a leadership role in creating this network of nature reserves in a way to protect biodiversity, but in a way that is compatible with the livelihoods, the traditional livelihoods of the indigenous people of the Arctic and the increasing industrial activities that are going to occur in the Arctic. Time is short, and Arctic biodiversity will not have much time. Thank you so much.